All right, let's go. Number 10. The One-Eyed Giant. In 1914, an Austrian paleontologist named Othenio Abel was working through the fossil beds of Sicily when he picked up something that stopped him. A skull, roughly twice the size of a human skull, with a single enormous hole punched into the center of its face. He turned it over in his hands. There was no mistaking what he was looking at. The skull belonged to an extinct dwarf elephant, a species that had shrunk down on Mediterranean islands after arriving there nearly 2 million years earlier. But Abel wasn't the first to hold one of these skulls and misread it. He was simply the first to write down, formally, what he suspected generations of ancient people had already concluded. The coastal caves around Messina, Palermo, and Trapani are thick with these fossils, the remains of Paleoloxodon falconeri and related dwarf elephant species that once roamed Sicily, Malta, Crete, and Cyprus before going extinct roughly 8,000 years ago. An elephant's trunk has no bone in it. Strip the flesh away, and the nasal cavity where the trunk once attached leaves behind a single cavernous socket sitting dead center in the skull, twice the size of either eye socket beside it, its edges smoothed round by millennia of erosion until the hollow looks less like a break in the bone and more like something that was always meant to be there. To a population that had never seen a living elephant and wouldn't for another 1,000 years until Alexander's campaigns brought them east. The skull reads as something else entirely. Not an elephant, a giant. A one-eyed giant, and beside the skull, scattered in the same cave sediment, the long bones of the same animal, proportionally massive, thick, and utterly unlike anything a human cave dweller could have left behind. Sicily is where the ancient world consistently placed the Cyclops. It is also the region richest in dwarf elephant fossil beds anywhere in the Mediterranean. Homer sends Odysseus into a cave in that exact territory in Book 9 of the Odyssey, and describes Polyphemus as a solitary giant with one eye in the middle of his forehead, herding sheep in a cave lined with the bones of previous visitors. The philosopher Empedocles, writing in Sicily in the 5th century BC, is recorded as having identified large ancient bones in his own region as giant remains, one of the earliest documented cases of a human being looking at a fossil and constructing a monster around it, centuries before anyone had a word for paleontology at all. What makes the geography particularly difficult to write off as coincidence is the density of the overlap. This isn't one skull in one cave loosely associated with a myth told somewhere in the Mediterranean. The fossil beds cluster specifically around Messina, Palermo, and Trapani, the same coastline classical geographers repeatedly named as Cyclops territory. While other Mediterranean islands with far fewer dwarf elephant deposits, Crete and Malta among them, correspondingly attracted far thinner giant lore in the ancient record. But here's where the fossil trail gets stranger. It took until 1688 for a scholar named Giovanni Giustino Ciampini to formally demonstrate, in writing, that these skulls belonged to an extinct elephant and not a race of giants. That means the misidentification wasn't a brief, easily corrected error. It survived, unchallenged in any scientific sense, for well over 2,000 years, long enough to travel from whatever Bronze Age sailor first crawled into a Sicilian cave and found the skull, into Homer's poem, into the temples and travelers' tales of classical Greece, and all the way into the library of a 17th century Roman scholar who finally looked at the bone and called it correctly. For 2 millennia, in other words, the wrong explanation was the only explanation anyone had, and it was wrong in a very specific, very consistent direction, never drifting into some other creature, always converging back onto the same one-eyed giant. The skulls are still there. Paleoloxodon falconeri specimens sit today in the Museum of Natural History of Verona, and in collections across Sicily and Malta, the single nasal cavity staring out from behind glass exactly the way it stared out at whoever found the first one, several thousand years before anyone wrote the word Cyclops. Number 9. The island that made men forget. 9 days of hostile wind blew Odysseus and his ships off their course around Cape Malea, according to Book 9 of the Odyssey, and on the 10th day they made landfall on an unfamiliar coast. The men who went ashore to scout the territory encountered a hospitable population who offered them something to eat, a sweet, honeyed fruit that Homer calls the lotus. The men who tasted it stopped wanting to go home. They wept when their crewmates tried to drag them back to the ships, and according to the account, some had to be forced bodily under the rowing benches and lashed down before the fleet could get back to open water. Odysseus, watching his own men need to be restrained like prisoners rather than rescued like castaways, made the decision on the spot. No one else was permitted ashore, and the ships left before nightfall. The ancient world did not treat this as pure invention. The historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, placed the lotus eaters on a promontory of the Libyan coast. Near a tribe he names the Gendanes, close to a body of water he calls Lake Triton, treating them not as a fantastical people in an unnamed corner of the map, but as a real ethnographic group positioned relative to other, uncontested populations of North Africa. 2 centuries later, the historian Polybius went further and named a specific island, Menonix, known today as Jerba, off the coast of modern Tunisia, recording the detail during accounts of the Roman general Regulus's campaign in the region. Strabo, writing his geography in the 1st century BC, confirmed the identification and described the island's terrain as wooded and fruit-bearing, suitable for exactly the plant the myth requires. 3 separate ancient authorities, writing across roughly 400 years, converged on the same stretch of North African coastline as the physical setting for an episode most modern readers assume is pure fantasy. The fruit itself has a name and a botanical identity. Polybius describes the lotus eaters preparing a fruit the size of an olive pit, sweet as a date, that could be crushed, stored, and fermented into a wine-like drink, a description matching Ziziphus lotus, a wild jujube relative still native to the Gulf of Gabes region around Jerba today. He describes 2 separate preparations by social rank: a coarser, whole fruit paste crushed and stored for servants, and a refined, pitted version reserved for free citizens. A level of ethnographic specificity that reads less like literary embellishment and more like a trade report from someone who had actually watched the process. Jerba's own archaeological record backs the geography further. The ancient port city of Menonix on the island was significant enough to be inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2023. Confirmed as a major Mediterranean settlement pattern stretching back through the classical period, with trade connections plausibly old enough to have brought Bronze Age Greek sailors into contact with the region well before Herodotus ever wrote a word about it. What makes the lotus entry particularly unsettling is not that ancient geographers agreed on a location. It's that they never agreed on what, exactly, the men actually ate. Some ancient sources describe a fermented, wine-like preparation of the jujuba fruit, and jujuba wine, unlike the raw fruit, carries a genuine mild intoxicant effect that could plausibly explain apathy and memory loss in a sailor's account. Other ancient writers use eating lotus as an idiom purely for forgetfulness and unmindfulness, disconnected from any specific plant at all. Jerba is real. Menonix is real and excavated. The jujube is real and grows there in exactly the density the ancient sources describe. What is not resolved, and has never been resolved by any single line of textual or botanical evidence, is which specific preparation, the raw fruit, the fermented wine, or something else entirely lost to time, produced an effect strong enough that grown sailors had to be bound in chains to leave it behind. Number 8. The strait that swallows ships. Between Sicily and the Italian mainland, at the narrowest point of what is now called the Strait of Messina. The water does something that ancient sailors had no framework to explain. 2 seas, the Tyrrhenian and the Ionian, meet in a channel only about 3 kilometers wide at its tightest point, and the difference in tide, temperature, and density between them generates alternating currents that can reach speeds of nearly 6 knots. When those currents collide with opposing wind, the surface doesn't just churn. It forms visible, rotating vortices strong enough to spin a small vessel off its heading entirely, a smooth, oily-looking patch of water sitting incongruously among choppy whitecaps, The kind of thing a modern sailor crossing the strait still photographs from the deck because it looks unmistakably wrong. In Book 12 of the Odyssey, Circe warns Odysseus that his route home runs directly between two horrors. On one side, a six-headed monster named Scylla, lodged in a cave in an unreachable cliff face, who will seize 6 of his men the instant the ship passes close. On the other, a creature named Charybdis, who 3 times a day swallows the entire sea and then vomits it back out, capable of taking the whole ship down if it drifts too near. Circe's advice is blunt: lose 6 men to Scylla rather than risk the ship and everyone in it to Charybdis. Odysseus's instinct, according to the poem, is to arm himself and fight. Circe tells him flatly that this is pointless, that Scylla cannot be killed, and that any attempt to resist will only cost him more men than the toll already demands. He takes the warning, says nothing to his crew about which side of the strait carries the worse fate, and steers toward the monster, who takes fewer. The whirlpool has a name today. Sailors and oceanographers call it the Garofalo, and it forms at a predictable location near Capo Peloro, on the Sicilian side of the strait, traditionally identified as Charybdis's exact position. It is not technically a circular whirlpool in the way ancient description implies. It is a churning convergence zone produced when strong wind blows against the tidal current. But the effect on a small ancient vessel would have looked and felt exactly like the mythic description. The rock formation on the Calabrian side, near the modern town of Scylla, which still carries the monster's name, presents jagged, cave-riddled cliffs precisely where local tradition places Scylla's lair. Modern shipping, with engines and depth sounders, generally clears the strait without incident, but maritime guides for the region still flag it as a serious hazard for smaller craft, warning sailors to time their passage to the tide or risk being caught in eddies strong enough to spin a hull sideways in open water. Sailing logs from recreational crews crossing the strait in recent years describe timing their transit to the minute. Motoring rather than sailing through the narrowest point specifically to retain steering control if the current runs stronger than forecast, modern caution, born from engines and charts, applied to precisely the same 3 kilometers of water Circe warned about in verse. Consider the implication. A myth built around a 6-headed monster, and a sea-swallowing beast is at its physical core. An accurate hazard map, 2 real, named GPEs, locatable dangers, on opposite sides of a strait 3 kilometers wide, that ancient sailors without instruments had to navigate by memory and nerve alone. The monsters are gone. The strait is not. The Garofalo still spins at Capo Peloro on the right combination of wind and tide. Indifferent to the fact that the story built to explain it outlived the civilization that told it. Before the second half of this list, if a countdown like this is the kind of thing worth your time, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs nothing to use it. Back to the list. Number 7. The Witch's Island that was never an island. On the southwest coast of Italy, roughly 100 kilometers south of Rome, a limestone ridge rises 541 meters straight out of the coastal plain, its silhouette so distinct from the sea that sailors for millennia have mistaken it for an island. It is called Monte Circeo. Ancient Greek and Roman tradition, as early as Hesiod in the 8th century BCE, identified this promontory as Aea, the island home of the sorceress Circe, where Homer says she turned Odysseus's men into swine with a drugged potion before Hermes intervened to protect him. The problem archaeologists and geographers have wrestled with for centuries is straightforward. Circeo is not, and has not been for a very long time, an actual island. It's connected to the mainland by a low strip of alluvial marshland. The Roman historian Procopius, writing in the 6th century CE, tried to resolve the contradiction by noting that the promontory has the appearance of an island from the sea, even though anyone standing on it can see it isn't one. That explanation has satisfied some scholars and unsettled others for the better part of 2,000 years. What isn't in dispute is what's actually been found on and inside the mountain. At the eastern end of the promontory sit the remains of Bronze Age Cyclopean walls, roughly 200 by 100 meters, built from megalithic blocks cut and fitted together without mortar in tight polygonal joints. The kind of construction technique associated with fortified elite sites in the same era the Odyssey claims to describe. Whoever built it clearly had resources and organized labor available on a scale worth defending. It is not the kind of structure a random fishing hamlet builds by accident. Deep within the mountain's cave system lies the Grotta Guattari, discovered in 1939 when workers quarrying stone broke through into a sealed chamber that had no other entrance. A cave that had been closed off from the outside world since sometime in the late Pleistocene. Inside, researchers uncovered one of the most significant Neanderthal fossil finds in Italian history. A single skull, positioned deliberately within a ring of stones, undisturbed for tens of thousands of years before the quarry workers' pickaxes broke through the rock that had sealed it in. Whoever found the opening first would have felt cool, stale air pushing out of a hole that had not exchanged breath with the surface world since long before anything resembling Greek civilization existed. The roadblock here is obvious to anyone who studies the site. Homer, in Book 11, describes a low island ringed by endless sea. A description that appears to flatly contradict a promontory that was already a peninsula by the time Homer composed anything. Skeptics have used exactly this contradiction to argue the identification is folk etymology, a coincidence of a striking landmark and a memorable name, nothing more. But then geologists point out something the skeptics don't account for. Sea levels and coastal sedimentation along this stretch of the Tyrrhenian have shifted substantially since the Bronze Age, and the marshland connecting Circio to the mainland, the Pontine Marshes, is largely a product of post-classical alluvial buildup, not a fixed feature of the landscape 3,000 years ago. The mountain didn't need to still be an island when Homer wrote. It only needed to look enough like one, often enough, for the memory to calcify into myth. A single Neanderthal skull still sits, cataloged and displayed, in the museum built to house what the mountain gave up. It was found by people looking for something else entirely. Deep inside a landmark the ancient world had already decided belonged to a sorceress. Number 6. The cargo that matches the gifts. In the summer of 1982, a sponge diver named Mehmet Akir was working the waters off Uluburun, a headland near Kah on Turkey's southern coast, when his hand brushed something on the seabed 40 meters down. That felt nothing like the rock or sponge he was used to finding. He surfaced and described it to colleagues in Yalkovac as metal biscuits with ears, flat rectangular slabs with 4 raised corners, stacked in rows on the sloping shelf of the headland. When the description reached the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, the archaeologists recognized it immediately. Without needing to see the object themselves, oxide ingots, the distinctive 4-handled copper slabs used for trade across the late Bronze Age Mediterranean. A sponge diver's confused, second-hand description of a strange shape on the ocean floor had just located one of the richest shipwrecks ever found from the ancient world, sitting essentially untouched since the 14th century BCE. 11 excavation seasons followed, running from 1984 to 1994, totaling more than 22,000 individual dives at a depth of over 40 meters. What came up was staggering, roughly 17 tons of material, including 10 tons of copper and a ton of tin. The raw components of bronze, alongside ivory, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber, Egyptian gold jewelry. Canaanite jars filled with terebinth resin, Cypriot pottery, and Mycenaean Greek ceramics, precisely dated to the late Helladic the 3A2 period, roughly 1400 to 1300 BCE. Divers also recovered a pair of hinged wooden writing tablets, the wax long since gone, but the wooden leaves intact, a physical example of exactly the kind of folding notebook Homer references elsewhere in the epic tradition. Proof that the technology wasn't a poetic flourish invented after the fact. Recent isotopic analysis, led by researchers including Michael Fricchetti of Washington University and St. Louis, traced roughly a third of the ship's tin all the way back to highland communities in what is now Uzbekistan, meaning a single Bronze Age vessel sailing the eastern Mediterranean was carrying metal that had already crossed most of the ancient world before it ever touched the water. Homer's Odyssey is saturated with this exact category of object. The poem's guest gift economy, xenia, the ritual exchange of precious metal, textiles, and finely worked goods between hosts and travelers, appears in nearly every court Odysseus or his son Telemachus visits, described in specific, itemized terms. A bronze cauldron, a set of tripods, cups of worked gold, fine woven robes, dyed and stored for exactly this kind of exchange. Ingots of raw metal, given not as currency, but as a diplomatic gesture between households that considered themselves equals. For a long time, this level of material specificity was treated by some scholars as poetic exaggeration, the invented luxury of an oral tradition dressing up its heroes with wealth no Iron Age audience could verify or dispute. But here's where the shipwreck reframes the poem entirely. The Uluburun cargo isn't a random assortment of trade goods. It's functionally a snapshot of the exact category of elite material culture the Odyssey obsessively itemizes: bronze components, worked gold, luxury imports moving between courts and kingdoms as diplomatic currency, not simple commerce. The ship's own timbers were felled, according to dendrochronological analysis, in the late 14th century BCE, squarely inside the same late Bronze Age world Homer's story claims to be describing, roughly a century before the war the poem hangs its entire plot on. The recovered cargo is now on permanent display at the Bodrum Museum of Underwater Archaeology in Turkey. Ingots stacked the way they were pulled from the seabed, resin jars still bearing the residue of what they once carried, amber beads strung exactly as excavators found them, and gold jewelry sealed under glass in a hall built specifically to house one shipwreck's cargo. Recent isotopic work has continued adding names and places to the manifest. The tin from Uzbekistan. Additional glass ingots traced by researchers including Caroline Jackson and Paul Nicholson to specific production centers. Each new analysis extending the trade network the ship represents a little further outward. Every visitor who walks that hall in Bodrum today is looking, piece by piece, cataloged and lit under glass, at exactly what kind of wealth a late Bronze Age ship, and by extension a late Bronze Age hero, would have been expected to carry home. Number 5. The archive that burned itself into permanence. In April of 1939, an American archaeologist named Carl Blegan climbed a low hilltop called Epano Inglianos in the region of Messenia in the southwestern Peloponnese on the recommendation of a local landowner who had noticed old stone blocks near the summit. Blegan had already made his name excavating Troy, and he arrived at the hilltop with a working hypothesis and a director from the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, Konstantinos Kourouniotis, at his side. He was looking, this time, for the palace Homer assigns to King Nestor, described in the Odyssey as ruler of sandy Pylos. The first stop on Telemachus's journey to find news of his missing father in Book 3. Blegan had planned the dig as a brief exploratory season. He did not expect what happened next. His team began digging on the very first day of excavation. Within hours, they had broken into a room stacked with small clay tablets inscribed with an unfamiliar script that had previously turned up only on Crete. It was Linear B, and this was the first time it had ever been found on the Greek mainland. William Andrew MacDonald, a young member of the team, on his hands and knees in the cramped archive room, spent days extracting the fragile tablets by hand in what Blegan's own excavation report later credited as work requiring extraordinary patience in conditions of extreme physical discomfort. By the end of that first season alone, the team had recovered roughly 600 tablets. Work resumed after the interruption of the Second World War, and by the time excavation concluded in the 1960s. The total from Pylos had climbed past 1,200 inscribed tablets and fragments. An administrative archive documenting personnel, land holdings, ritual offerings, and military rosters for a Mycenaean palatial state that flourished in the 14th and 13th centuries BC. The palace itself, once fully excavated. matched the scale Homer implies without ever describing directly, roughly 170 rooms across more than 2,000 square meters, a central megaron dominated by a circular hearth over 4 meters across, storerooms lined with wine jars, and, near the entrance, exactly where an administrator would want quick access to it, the archive room itself. One of the tablets recovered from that room, a linear B inventory of ritual tripods and vessels now cataloged as PY-TA 641, has been described by specialists as probably the single most famous tablet the script has ever produced. It was inscribed, based on later dating of the destruction layer around it, only shortly before the fire that ended the palace, meaning the very last acts of record keeping this administration performed are among the words that survived it. Consider the implication of how close this archive came to being lost twice over. Unbaked clay dissolves. It does not survive 3,000 years of rain and shifting soil unless something accidentally fires it hard, the way a kiln fires pottery. And even once fired, the Linear B script sat unread for over a decade. A graduate student named Emmett Bennett spent years reconstructing the sign system from photographs, publishing a foundational study in 1947 before completing a full transcription in 1951 that would go on to become one of the critical stepping stones for the architect Michael Ventris to finally crack the script's underlying. Language in 1952. The decipherment revealed something scholars had not expected going in, an early form of Greek, centuries older than anyone had proof the language had existed in written form. None of these tablets would exist for modern scholars to read if the palace had simply been abandoned. They survive because the same catastrophic fire that destroyed Pylos near the end of the 13th century BC also baked the unfired clay tablets solid, a building's destruction accidentally functioning as a kiln, preserving in permanent form the very documents that would otherwise have dissolved back into mud within a generation. The identity of whoever or whatever burned the palace remains debated among specialists, ranging from internal conflict to the broader wave of destructions associated with the era's collapse. The palace burned once, near the close of the Bronze Age, and in doing so, it fixed its own last administrative year into a form that would outlast every dynasty, language, and empire that came after it. The archive room still sits, excavated and roofed for protection, on the same Messenian hilltop where a landowner once noticed a few unusual stones sticking out of the ground. Number 4. The Siege Layer. Wilhelm Dürkbiefeld, and later Karl Blagen, and later still a German archaeologist named Manfred Korfmann, all dug into the same mound at Hisarlik, on Turkey's northwestern coast. And all three found the same thing stacked on top of each other, a city built, destroyed, and rebuilt at least 9 times across 3,000 years, labeled by archaeologists simply Troy the First through Troy the Next. The layer that matters for Homer's war sits at Troy the Sixth and Troy the Ea, dated to the late Bronze Age, somewhere between roughly 1700 and 1180 BCE. Troy v6 was wealthy and heavily fortified, with massive defensive walls, fine imported pottery, and, notably, horses kept within the citadel itself, a detail that lines up with Homer's recurring epithet for the Trojans as tamers of horses. That city came down around 1300 BC, most likely to an earthquake, and Korfmann's team later found direct physical proof of the sequence, a house from Troy v6. Crushed by the earthquake, with a completely new house from Troy the Ea built directly on top of its ruins, one destruction layered immediately over another, undisturbed, at the same excavated point in the trench. What was rebuilt on that spot, known as Troy the Ea, tells an entirely different story. When Blegen's team cleared the layer in the 1930s, they found arrowheads embedded in the defensive walls, human skeletons left unburied in the streets and inside 2 separate houses near the south gate, bodies that had been left where they fell rather than given any burial rite, and heaps of sling bullets scattered through the destruction debris. As Blegen himself pointed out, a city that successfully repelled an attack collects its spent sling stones afterward for reuse. Ammunition was too valuable to leave lying in the street. A city that falls doesn't get the chance. Whoever was living in Troy v Ea when it burned did not have time to clean up after the fighting, let alone rebuild. when Korfmann resumed excavation in 1988 with a team from the University of Tübingen. He expanded the picture dramatically. Magnetometer surveys and new trenches revealed a lower city extending far beyond the small citadel walls previously known. Protected in the 13th century BCE by a U-shaped defensive ditch cut directly into bedrock, roughly 3.5 meters wide, ringing the settlement's outer edge. Troy wasn't the minor hilltop outpost some 20th century skeptics had assumed. It was a substantial regional center guarding the entrance to the Dardanelles, precisely the kind of prize worth a decade of war in an oral tradition. Here's where the roadblock comes in. For much of the 20th century, mainstream opinion treated the idea of a historical Trojan War as, at best, an exaggerated folk memory of a minor border skirmish. The citadel Blagen and Darktefeld had excavated looked cramped, a few hundred meters across, nowhere near large enough to justify 10 years of siege by a coalition fleet. Skeptics had a reasonable case. A fortress this small did not seem worth a decade-long war. Then, Korfmann's team ran magnetometer surveys across the plain beyond the citadel walls and found what earlier excavators had simply never thought to look for: an entire lower city, protected by a defensive ditch cut straight into bedrock, roughly 3.5 meters wide, ringing a settlement many times larger than the citadel alone. The case for a minor skirmish collapsed under the same soil that had concealed it. The scale of the lower city Korfmann's surveys uncovered is what makes the siege plausible in the first place. Earlier excavators had worked with a citadel footprint of only a few hundred meters across, barely large enough to house a garrison, let alone a city worth a coalition war. The ditch in the settlement it enclosed extended the plausible population and defensible area by a wide multiple, transforming Troy from a fortress into a genuine regional capital controlling the entrance to the Dardanelles, the strait linking the Aegean to the Black Sea, and, with it, the trade routes that made the location worth fighting over at all. Excavations resuming as recently as 2024, led by archaeologist Arstem Aslan, and continuing into 2025, have added fresh material to the same destruction layer. Dozens of smoothed riverstone sling bullets, concentrated in a tight cluster just outside where the palace walls would have stood, sit alongside charred building remains and skeletons that were buried in haste rather than with any funerary ritual, bodies covered quickly, not laid out with care. Aslan has described the concentration of ammunition in such a small area as consistent with a desperate close-range defense, a final stand rather than an orderly retreat. Combined with earlier arrowhead finds from Blegen's and Korfmann's seasons, the pattern across nearly a century of excavation, by 3 separate teams working decades apart, keeps landing on the same conclusion: close quarters fighting ending badly at this exact location. The identity of the attackers is not recoverable from bronze arrowheads and burned timber alone, and serious archaeologists are careful to say so. What the destruction layer of Troy Villa does confirm, without ambiguity, is that a real, fortified, strategically significant late Bronze Age city at this exact location was violently destroyed by human hands around 1180 BCE, inside the same narrow window ancient Greek chronographers independently calculated for the fall of Troy, centuries before anyone had excavated a single stone to check. Number 3. The day the sun died. Ancient commentators had noticed the strangeness of the passage for a very long time before anyone had the tools to test it. In Book 20 of the Odyssey, on the day Odysseus finally slaughters the suitors who have overrun his household, the prophet Theoclymenus delivers a warning to the assembled hall. The sun has vanished from the sky, and a lethal darkness has covered everything. In the middle of what should be broad daylight, ancient writers, including Plutarch and Heraclitus, read this as a poetic description of an actual total solar eclipse, not a metaphor for doom, but a memory of something the audience of the poem, or its earliest sources, might genuinely have witnessed. In the late 1920s, astronomers Carl Schoch and Otto Neugebauer sat down with the raw orbital mechanics and calculated that a total eclipse did pass directly over the Ionian Islands on April 16, 1178 BC. and that it was the only eclipse in over a century to line up with the classical estimate for the fall of Troy roughly a decade earlier. What Theoclymenus' warning teased at the start of the poem's climax, the orbital math would not confirm for another 80 years. For most of the 20th century, that was where the case sat. An intriguing coincidence, disputed by scholars who doubted a single ambiguous phrase should carry that much evidentiary weight. Then, in 2008, physicist Marcello Magnasco of the Rockefeller University and astronomer Constantino Baicouzis of the Observatorio Astronomico in La Plata, Argentina, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that approached the problem from a completely different angle. Rather than relying on the disputed eclipse line at all, they combed the poem for other independent astronomical references, details most readers skim past as scenery. What they found was a sequence of 4 separate celestial markers, each tied to a specific number of days before the slaughter. 29 days before, the poem places 2 constellations, the Pleiades and Boats, simultaneously visible at sunset. An alignment produced by Earth's position relative to those star groups that only recurs at specific, calculable dates decades or centuries apart. Not something a poet could simply invent and expect to land on a real configuration by chance. 33 days before, a passage describing the god Hermes traveling far to the west before returning, which the researchers interpret as a description of Mercury's position near the western limit of its orbital swing, the planet the Romans would later name directly after the same messenger god. 6 days before, Venus is described as high and visible in the sky, and on the day of the slaughter itself, Homer states more than once that it is the time of a new moon, a specific detail, and notably also a precondition for any total solar eclipse to occur at all, since an eclipse can only happen when the moon sits directly between the Earth and the sun. None of these 4 events recurs on the same calendar date more than once within any reasonable span of decades. Searching within 100 years of the accepted Trojan War time frame for a single date where all 4 align. Baicouzis and Magnasco found exactly one candidate, April 16, 1178 BCE, the identical date Schoch and Neugebauer had calculated 80 years earlier for the eclipse, arrived at completely independently, without assuming the eclipse reference was even real. Magnasco was careful, in interviews following the paper's publication, not to overstate the finding. Under the assumption that our work turns out to be correct, it adds to the evidence that he knew what he was talking about. He told one interviewer at the time, before immediately clarifying the limits of that claim. It does not prove Odysseus existed, or that the slaughter of the suitors happened on that day, or that the Trojan War took place at all. It only proves, in Magnasco's own words, that Homer, or whoever fed the tradition its details, knew about certain astronomical phenomena that occurred centuries before his own lifetime. What it demonstrates is that a poet working centuries after the events he claims to describe encoded a set of astronomical relationships so specific and so mutually consistent that modern orbital mechanics can run the numbers today and land on a single unrepeated date matching what Greek chronographers had estimated on entirely separate historical grounds, 2,500 years before anyone owned a telescope. Whether that knowledge arrived through genuine oral memory stretching back to the Bronze Age, or through some other transmission modern scholarship has not yet identified, the sky itself has not changed its answer. Run the orbital mechanics again today, on any date within a century of the accepted fall of Troy, and the calculation still returns to April 16th, 1178 BCE. Number 2. The world that ended. Every kingdom Odysseus tries to reach on his 10-year journey home belongs to a world that, by the time Homer was composing the poem centuries later, had already ceased to exist. Somewhere between 1200 and 1150 BC, in a span most archaeologists now compress into a single generation, nearly every major palatial center in the eastern Mediterranean went down in fire and was never rebuilt at the same scale again. Pylos burned, its archive baked solid by the same fire that ended it. Mycenae was destroyed and reoccupied only as a diminished shadow of itself. The Hittite capital at Hattusa was abandoned outright, a city that had ruled an empire simply emptied out. At Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, excavators found something that stops most visitors cold. A kiln room where a scribe had been in the middle of firing a batch of clay tablets when the city fell. The oven still loaded, one letter never finished. The correspondence describes enemy ships already sighted approaching the coast. The scribe evidently believed there was still time to bake the batch and send word. There wasn't. The tablets sat exactly where he left them, half-fired, for over 3,000 years, until archaeologists lifted them out of the same kiln he had been tending when the attack came. Egyptian temple inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu describe a coalition of maritime raiders. A loose confederation, modern scholarship groups under the label Sea Peoples, sweeping down the Levantine coast and overwhelming kingdom after kingdom that had stood, in some cases, for centuries. The inscriptions list named groups moving as a unit, land and sea forces together. Consuming everything in their path with a completeness the Egyptian scribes clearly found remarkable enough to carve into stone in detail. The historian and archaeologist Eric Klein, in his widely cited synthesis of the period, argues the true cause wasn't any single invasion, but a cascading systems collapse, drought, earthquake clusters, interrupted trade networks, and internal unrest compounding each other until the entire interconnected Late Bronze Age world, the same world that produced the Uluburun cargo and the Pylos archive, buckled all at once, each failing kingdom pulling its trading partners down with it. Homer's Odyssey is, structurally, a story about a hero trying to sail home through the wreckage of exactly this collapse. Every court Telemachus visits in the poem's opening books, Pylos, Sparta, is described as a fated remnant, ruled by aging survivors reminiscing about a war fought in a world that no longer quite exists. Consider the implication: a poem assembled and performed centuries after the fact, in an oral tradition with no access to archaeological stratigraphy or Egyptian temple records. Nonetheless preserves the emotional and political texture of a genuine civilizational rupture. Grand palaces reduced to memory, a generation of returning warriors finding a diminished and dangerous world rather than the one they left. The scale of what disappeared is difficult to hold in the mind all at once, within roughly one human lifetime. The interconnected trade network that produced a cargo like the one recovered at Uluburun, tin from Central Asia, ivory from Africa, amber from the Baltic, all moving through Mediterranean ports on the same ships, simply stopped functioning. Literacy itself contracted. Linear B, the script Blegan pulled out of the ground at Pylos, went out of use entirely and would not be replaced by a new form of Greek writing for centuries. An entire category of political organization, the palatial redistribution economy that produced the archives, and the guest gift wealth Homer's poem takes for granted, ceased to exist across an area stretching from the Peloponnese to the Levant. The destruction layers from this collapse are not confined to one excavation or one country. They are still there, physically, in the ground at Pylos, at Mycenae, at Ugarit, at Hattusa, at dozens of other sites across the eastern Mediterranean. A shared, datable, archaeologically consistent horizon of fire and abandonment stretching from Greece to Anatolia to the Levant. The poem never names the collapse. It doesn't need to. It simply drops its hero into the middle of the wreckage and lets him try to find a way home through it. Number 1. The island that wasn't where it was supposed to be. For more than 2,000 years, every reader of the Odyssey has assumed that Odysseus's kingdom, Ithaca, is the same landmass that carries that name today, a small island in the Ionian Sea east of Cephalonia. The problem, which classical scholars have quietly acknowledged since antiquity, is that Homer's own geography doesn't match it. In Book 9, Odysseus describes his home to the Phaeacian court as low-lying and facing west, the farthest out to sea of a cluster of neighboring islands that includes Same, Zacynthus, and one called Dulichium, whose location no one has ever confidently pinned down. Modern Ithaki faces east, It is mountainous, not low-lying. And despite more than a century of searching, it has never produced archaeological evidence of a major Bronze Age settlement anywhere close to the scale the poem implies for a king who could raise 12 ships for a 10-year war. Heinrich Schliemann, fresh off identifying Troy and Mycenae, searched modern Ithaki, specifically looking for Odysseus's palace. He found nothing that matched. In 2003, a British management consultant named Robert Biddlestone, working from geology textbooks and satellite imagery rather than a classical scholar's training, noticed something in the terrain of neighboring Cephalonia that no one else had connected to the puzzle. A western peninsula of the island, called Peliki, matched Homer's description almost exactly, low-lying, west-facing, positioned as the outermost of the group. The only obstacle to identifying it as ancient Ithaca was that Peliki is not an island today. It is a peninsula, joined to the rest of Cephalonia by the Thynia Valley, a low saddle of land that reaches roughly 180 meters above sea level at its highest point. Biddlestone's hypothesis, published in 2005 as Odysseus Unbound through Cambridge University Press with philologist James Diggle and geologist John Underhill, required something that sounded almost too convenient to be real, that this valley had once been a navigable marine channel, separating Peliki from the rest of Cephalonia during the Late Bronze Age, and that repeated earthquakes and landslides over the following centuries had filled it in, quietly converting an island into a peninsula and erasing the geography Homer described from the map. Entirely. Here is the roadblock, and it is a serious one. For nearly 2 decades, the central weakness in Biddlestone's case was simple. Nobody had found geological proof that the Thynia Valley had ever actually held open seawater during the right period. Reviewers, even sympathetic ones, called the theory brilliant and possibly correct, but incomplete. Underhill, a geoscientist, spent more than 20 years methodically surveying the valley's subsurface to test it directly. The reversal came recently. Drilling and stratigraphic analysis published by Underhill's team confirmed that a continuous watercourse had indeed run through the valley intermittently, consistent with a channel that could plausibly have separated Peliki from the rest of Cephalonia during the relevant era, before landslip debris, triggered by the region's well-documented seismic activity, filled it to its present elevation. Combined with newly discovered Bronze Age archaeological sites on the Peliki Peninsula itself, including remains at Lavati Marsh identified as a candidate for Odysseus's harbor, the geoscience, the textual description, and the archaeological record converged on the same conclusion at nearly the same time. The book's reception, even before any of the geoscience was resolved, had already split the classical establishment in an unusual way. Some reviewers dismissed a management consultant's amateur theory outright. Others, including senior classicists with no obvious reason to flatter an outsider, went out of their way to say the opposite. Gregory Nagy of Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies called the reconstruction convincingly Homeric in feel. A scholar at the University of Lisbon's Centro de Estudos Clásicos wrote that reading the Odyssey would likely never feel the same again. That kind of divided, provisional endorsement, brilliant idea, insufficient proof is exactly the position serious scholarship should take toward a genuinely open question. It is not the position scholarship tends to hold for 2 straight decades unless the underlying case keeps refusing to die. For that convergence to be coincidental, the coincidence would have to extend not just to the shape of one peninsula resembling one poetic description, but to the exact orientation Homer specifies. The exact relative position among 3 other named islands whose modern identities are independently uncontested, and the geological confirmation of a landform that no one but a geologist studying 20 years of subsurface data could have verified. Mary Beard called the odds of Biddlestone being right a very fair chance indeed. Peter Green called it almost certainly correct. Neither of them had the drilling results that exist today. It is worth setting this alongside the rest of what this list has already covered. The palace at Pylos was buried under the wrong assumption for 3,000 years, until a landowner noticed a few stones sticking out of a hillside. Troy sat under a mound skeptics considered too small to matter until a magnetometer survey revealed a lower city no one had thought to look for. In both cases, the correction came from someone willing to distrust the assumed geography and test the ground itself rather than the tradition built on top of it. The search for Ithaca is the same story, simply decades further along, and as of this year. Resolved by the same kind of stubborn fieldwork that broke open Pylos and Troy before it. If ancient Ithaca was never the island bearing that name in the present day, the implication runs well past a footnote for classicists. It means the search for Bronze Age Ithaca, the actual capital of a Homeric kingdom, the palace, the harbor. The site all of this evidence has been circling for 3,000 years hasn't concluded. It has, for the first time, been pointed at the correct island. The map has not been redrawn. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.